Thanks, Emily. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. And thank you to the Seattle Downtown Association for putting together this panel. We were just chatting earlier that it's been well over a year since we first felt the effects of the pandemic. And as we all know, Seattle was one of the first and hardest hit cities in the US. And it's really through the hard work of everyone that we have been able to minimize the effects compared to other regions. And fortunately, there are positive signs that we are turning the corner. As many of you may have heard, Governor Jay Inslee recently announced that the state is moving toward a statewide June 30th reopening. And this is just great news for our community and downtown businesses and elsewhere in the state. As the situation around COVID-19 improves, Amazon is making plans to have our employees gradually return to the office. Our plan is to return to an office-centric culture as our baseline. The timelines for returning to the office will vary, and our return to the office will be gradual. We expect more people will restart coming into the office probably through the summer, and most back in the office by the early fall. But even now, 10% of our corporate population currently works from the office each day, as Amazon's offices remain open throughout the last year. We never really closed our office. And I'm happy to say that restaurants, cafes, and shops in our buildings are planning to reopen soon. And we look forward to making our return to Seattle strong and vibrant, and being a part of our downtown core. Looking back to the last year, I would say that I'm proud to say that the work we have done throughout the pandemic to help our community. And as a company with deep roots and a large presence in Seattle, we acted at the start of the pandemic to provide relief where we could. We created the Neighborhood Small Business Relief Fund, which helped to disperse more than 11 million in cash grants and free rent to more than 900 small businesses in the community. And we donated nearly 9,000 laptops to Seattle Public School students who needed assistance and devices in transitioning to remote learning. And we are continuing to leverage our logistic expertise and donating services through the community delivery program to provide meals to approximately 2,500 Seattle public school students per week. And recently, we collaborated with the Ballard Food Bank to continue this program well into the year and beyond. And a few weeks ago, we marked the 1-year anniversary of welcoming families into the newest Mary's Place shelter. This new building in the heart of our campus has helped more than 85 families find housing amid the pandemic, providing a safe shelter for those who need it most. And finally, we worked with Virginia Mason Franciscan Health and opened vaccination clinics on site at our Seattle Meeting Center. And I'm happy to share that we have delivered more than 75,000 COVID-19 vaccine doses to date at this clinic. While the end is nearly in sight, it is of no doubt that the impact of COVID-19 will be felt for some time. And we're proud of the work that we've done and are continuing to support our Seattle neighbors and the community. We will continue to partner with local leaders in an effort to support the city in coming back even stronger than before. And I look forward to learning more today about how downtown across the country are planning and mobilizing for recovery and what we can learn from their efforts. And with that, I would like to introduce Cairo radio host and historian, Felix Banal, who will lead today's discussion.
Good morning. Thank you, Taylor. Thanks, Emily. Thanks to Downtown Seattle Association for producing this series of programs. Thanks to Amazon for their support. It's been a strange time, but it's been nice to have this way to connect with each other and learn what's going on in different parts of the city and different parts of the country. And I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. You are part of the conversation, and we will definitely be monitoring the Q&A and the chat, and we'll be coming to your questions probably throughout the program. So please feel free to chime in whenever you have an idea. Definitely type in your question. I am Felix Banal. I will be moderating, and I'll try and get out of the way of our three terrific panelists who I'll now introduce. First, we have Neil Albert, President and CEO of the Downtown DC Business Improvement District. Neil's been on the job since September 2015. Before that, he was Senior Policy Advisor at Holland and Knight. He's also served as City Administrator and Deputy Mayor in DC for multiple administrations. David Downey is President and CEO of the International Downtown Association. In this role, David works to keep the International Downtown Association the world leader and champion for vital and livable urban centers. David previously served as the Managing Director for the American Institute of Architects Urban Design Center and as Executive Director for the Michigan chapter of the American Planning Association. And finally, Jessica Lappin is President of the Alliance for Downtown New York. Since 2014, Jessica has managed New York City's, which is also the country's, largest business improvement district, working to ensure that Lower Manhattan is a thriving and dynamic community. She's a lifelong New Yorker and former elected official with a long record of contributions to civic life and public service. Thanks for taking time to be with us today in Seattle, virtually, Neil, David, and Jessica. Jessica, I'd like to start with you, and then we'll get to Neil on the same question. Why don't you just sort of give us an eyewitness report kind of on the ground there about current conditions in Lower Manhattan among the businesses that you and your alliance serve? How's the recovery going? What's going on right now?
Well, I mean, today is sort of a hopeful day because the sun is shining and the governor has lifted our mandates as of this week in terms of capacity and masks and other things. So, it's been, like I know obviously Seattle was very hard hit, everywhere in the country was hit, and it was tough. New York was, New York had it pretty rough, and in and out of shutdowns and lockdowns, but I think we're at a moment where over half of the population here has been fully vaccinated. People are starting to feel more optimistic and slowly starting to either return to work or make plans to bring people back to work. All
right. Neil, what about in DC?
Yeah, I think we're seeing the same kind of trend in Washington, DC. There's a lot of optimism in the air. The mayor of our city has lifted most restrictions, or will be lifting most of them by this Friday, which means that sort of the major drivers of our economy can start purring again. If DC is a tourist city, and tourists are beginning to trickle in every year, 22 million people visit Washington, DC. Is a large part of our economy, and that source of revenue obviously dried up over the last year and a half, but we're happy to see people out and about and visiting our monuments and memorials again. So yeah, things are on the upswing and we're optimistic.
And David, would you say that this is sort of a consistent message you're hearing from around the country from your members, or are there outliers who are doing either better than this or not as good as this?
It's really been an interesting pandemic because IDA serves members all throughout North America. And so early on, we talked about the hammer and the dance. So when restrictions went in, it was a hammer, but then it was a dance to reopen, sometimes going back into semi-closures. So many of our members downtowns, if you're in the Arizona, Texas, Florida region, you were open, much sooner. The rest of the country in the U.S. Is enjoying, as was described, a resurgence for reopening. But in Canada, they're actually went back into lockdown, closing schools, closing businesses. And I think that's the one thing that we've realized is every region is slightly different. But by and large, it is, I think, hopeful that we're seeing most U.S. downtowns on the verge of reopening.
And one of the things that people think about when they're making plans to return to the office on a regular basis, or even on just an episodic basis, is transit, and whether there'll be enough capacity there for the people who want to take advantage of, whether it's buses or light rail or whatever the form of transportation is for the particular city. And anyone can take this question. What's the transit situation like in your particular downtown? Is the transit system ready? Are people using it yet? Are they still sanitizing the surfaces? What's mass transit like right now?
Jessica, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, we, again, just this week went back to 24/7 service in the New York City subways, and it was somewhat unprecedented to have it shut down for a few hours overnight during the pandemic. I take the subway to work. I'm in my office by Wall Street today. It's starting to get more crowded. for sure. I think one of the things that we love about this downtown is, in addition to the 12 subway lines, we have ferries that come over from Jersey. We obviously have the Staten Island ferry. We have ferries that come over from the East River. People bike over the Brooklyn Bridge. People walk over the bridge. So we've certainly seen an uptick in people taking other modes of transportation. I think there is some, or has been some reticence around mass transit and the subways. But truthfully, again, with so many people being vaccinated and there are more police officers and others in the subway system monitoring what's going on, I hope that people will. I mean, that is the lifeblood of New York City, not just of Lower Manhattan. If people aren't comfortable getting in the subways, we have a real problem. But I think, again, the more people dip their toe in, the more they start to get into the habit of commuting again, then the less uncomfortable they're going to feel.
Yeah, so in DC, the transit system sort of serves not just the District of Columbia, but the region, and close to 85% of the daily users of our transit system are employees commuting to and from work. So when that pipeline dried up, obviously our transit system went into some severe trouble. So we are, however, seeing a slight uptick in ridership. Ridership was, a month or so ago, about 5%. It's not that much greater. It's probably like 10, 11% right now, but it's certainly an increase. I took the metro recently. So rather than me being the only person in the car, I had 4 or 5 others in the car, which is a positive sign. But Metro is doing a good, we call it the system Metro here in DC. Metro is doing a good job of publicizing how safe it is to return to use, but it's going to be tied to when people return to office here in DC.
And there's sort of a kind of a chicken and egg thing there, of course, with the capacity and the ridership and everything. Is there coordination going on behind the scenes, between the transit agencies and organizations like yours that sort of have their finger on the pulse of people's planned return, or is it more sort of a guessing game or a wait and see kind of thing? What's the coordination that's going on behind the scenes?
So
Jessica,
in DC,
go ahead, Neil.
So in DC is one big town if you ever lived here, and so there is necessary collaboration on everything, like big cities like yours and New York, and so there's strong advocacy in some sectors of the business community for the reopening of the metro system. There's a group called the Federal City Council here in DC that's been sort of leading that effort to encourage the return of ridership. We have a wonderful leader of our transit system, our general manager, who is constantly in touch with the business community and all communities, quite frankly, encouraging them to use the transit system, but also speaking about how safe it is. So there's real good coordination. I think the big issue for us is going, I'm sure it is for New York City Transit also, with the pandemic, there's been a real decrease in ridership and a real decrease in revenue. And so there's going to be real serious conversations over the next couple of months about how the transit system maintains its solvency here in DC.
That's exactly right. The trains didn't stop running. I mean, both to serve essential workers and others. There were just nobody on them and nobody paying the fares. And in fact, even the buses for a time during the pandemic were free purposely. They didn't want people getting by the fare box near the drivers. So we got a little bit of a bailout from Washington. Thank you, President Biden. But I think that's the big question and issue in terms of our transit system is really the capital budget and how that's going to be managed. I mean, vis-a-vis coordination, I think, our mayor and our governor don't get along. Very nice way of putting it.
You're kidding. I hadn't heard that before.
They either don't talk or take swipes at each other on Twitter. They kneecap each other at every opportunity. So, and mass transit is no different. They're fighting this week about the number of officers that have been put into the subways. It's too many, it's too little, it's too soon, it's too late. It's hard to keep track. But I would say just from a rider's perspective, again, I'm going to be a little, it's been delightful. The subways have never been cleaner. They're sparkling. I can get a seat during rush hour. They take half the time because there's no traffic on the tracks. So, for those of us who have been taking the subway during the pandemic, maybe we were Meshuggah, that's quite possible, but it was a lovely experience. So I'm not ready to be jostled during rush hour again.
And issues around transit. I mean, in some ways, transit obviously has never paid for itself. It's always been heavily subsidized, and the pandemic just sort of merely magnified some of these things. Some of these issues that are the gaps between what it costs for the riders versus what it costs for the whole system to operate. But kind of a bigger question, stepping back a little bit, is as we move toward the more robust part of the recovery, whether it's at the end of June here in Washington State, or maybe sooner in other parts of the country. This notion of the future of work, there have been these conversations about whether it relates to real estate, whether companies need to have as large a footprint in these downtown buildings, and what that means if workers choose to work from home more, or if you have workers who've moved to other parts of the country. David, this notion of the future of work conversation, is that playing out kind of behind the scenes? Are people being transparent and open, or is that future of work conversation still a little bit taboo right now when we're talking about trying to get people back to the office and back to their downtowns?
I'd say the conversation actually has been transpiring for the last several months, but obviously waiting to see what, the major employers do. I mean, just hearing Taylor's announcement of what Amazon's plans are for, its workforce is impressive. And it's the kind of commitment that I think we're hoping we'll see a great deal more of. It's my personal opinion that while we've proven the ability to work remotely, that our economy and our innovation economy would suffer long-term if that became the standard. So when we hear, major employers like Amazon, or if we get into the other tech firms of, the Microsofts and Facebooks of the world, when they start to make similar announcements, then I think we're going to see a sea change. That said, our research shows that the workforce would like to embrace hybrid to a greater detail. And there's an expectation that hybrid will become an option. How that plays out in the square footage for office, I think is something that we're going to have to wait and see how that's effective. But on any level of downsizing, I think the best thing is looking for the opportunity for new business, for more diverse business, for growth in small business and entrepreneurship, and just really using it as an opportunity to make our urban centers even more complete.
And Neil, are people in DC, do you know of businesses or large government employers who are working on persuasion tactics or ways to entice people to return to work? Or is it going to be more sort of a, here's the date you must report to your desk and turn off Zoom and all that sort of stuff?
No, we leave that to David Downey to help pave the way. Now in DC, there's a real coordinated effort between the employment sector, so people who make the decisions as to return to office, and the government. So there's a 3-pronged campaign that's currently on the way. One is a return to office pledge that is being led by this entity called the Federal City Council. And so over 300 employers have already signed that pledge, and more. It was launched like a week and a half ago, and that will continue. It's really people saying when it's safe to come back to the office, we will do so. The other initiative that we recently put in place is by another entity in DC to incentivize folks who come, particularly downtown, for work by giving coffee and other free giveaways for folks who come downtown. And then finally, my organization is leading the effort on behalf of the city to do a PR campaign to encourage people to return to the office when it's safe to do so. And according to our mayor, it's safe to do so immediately. So there's a real coordinated effort between the government and the private sector to make that a reality sooner rather than later.
What about in New York City, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, I think, nobody has a crystal ball, but I will say, it very obviously varies by company and industry, but it's been interesting. I mean, we saw Google gobbling up space during the pandemic. Mike Bloomberg has said, I'm at my desk. You want to talk to me? Here's where I'm at. Jamie Dimon has said, I'm not doing any more Zoom. That's it. It's over. I'm done with Zoom. So you're starting to see some of the larger employers be more forceful about bringing people back. But that said, the smaller, medium-sized businesses, which are really the bulk, I think are going to make their own decisions. I don't think we're going to be 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, but I certainly don't think that the office is dead. I think that's just not, how we're going to roll. Government workers, the mayor just started bringing them back slowly the last week or two. We would like to see that ramp up. That will be helpful to us in Lower Manhattan. And we are, similar to something that Neil mentioned, kind of working on an incentive program, a sort of welcome back program for them and for others in terms of, either giveaways or scavenger hunts or whatever it will be. And then we are going to be launching a large scale, for us, marketing campaign kind of later in the summer, geared somewhat toward tourists. Obviously, tourists for us also fell off the cliff, but also making people come back to the office sort of feel welcome. And as a precursor to that, we have online, we're calling it Explorer in Chief. We had launched a national competition right before the pandemic to sort of hire an influencer to put them up here for 3 months and have them document the neighborhood. Clearly, we put that on pause. He just moved in a couple weeks ago and has been posting. He has about 500,000 followers on Twitter himself, and he's a street photographer, beautiful photographer. So he went to the Statue of Liberty yesterday. I don't know what he's doing today. We had a performing arts festival last weekend. So, that's the kind of, I was nervous that maybe it was a little too soon. We had to make this decision a couple months ago of when to launch him. And in the end, just by pure luck, the timing is sort of perfect as a way to start to promote what's happening here and that it's safe and that it's active and to make people want to come back.
And there's a few related questions from the audience I can kind of synthesize into a single question about messaging. Essential premise that prior to the shutdown and during the early stages of the shutdown, the government was very strong about why we're shutting down and what shutdown means. Now, as reopening and recovery is here and on the horizon, that message seems to be stepped back a bit from the government. They're leaving it more to the private sector and individual companies and people. And maybe this is a question for David first. Do you know of cities that have really good messages or really good campaigns already underway to lure people back? I think what Jessica's talking about, an influencer, I'd love to be in New York for 3 months posting pictures on social media. That'd be awesome. Are there other things like that we've heard about where these almost guerrilla style marketing campaigns or more formal messaging efforts to bring people back, persuade people, let them know what's going on in their particular areas?
Again, in many of, for instance, the Florida cities, there was an outcry, if you will, just to the citizenry that the community was open. But I think more traditionally, I'll say, much like Neil was talking about the commitment to reopen, downtown Denver is doing a lot of work to communicate the openness, the health protocols that are in place as an entire employment base. Early on, downtown Vancouver did a great job of talking about when you are ready. And this goes back almost 4 months ago, talking about a marketing campaign that it was functional, it was open, health protocols were in place in the heat of the pandemic. I think what we're now just beginning to hear about is these intended campaigns that will launch that are really more consumer focused and really going beyond just the workforce returning, but talking even beyond, the staycation leisure travel, but looking at more regional travel as well. And those are just now emerging. So we haven't seen too many of them hit the mainstream just yet, but many have them in the works, I'll say.
Okay. I want to shift gears a little bit. During the pandemic, there were lots of steps that were taken by some retailers, restaurants in particular, to adapt to the lockdown, adapt to not being able to serve people at tables in their restaurants. Are there things that took place or that were adopted during the pandemic to make it easier for small business that are going to stick around once the pandemic's officially over? Neil, you want to take that question?
Sure. So many cities, not just Washington, D.C., had to adjust really quickly to support their retail, particularly restaurant retail. And so, there's a lot of things like streeteries and, outdoor cafes that popped out, and the cities, or particularly Washington, D.C., sort of adjusted its infrastructure and its permit requirements to facilitate that. There's a big call in DC for a lot of that to be permanent. So, I think the city has to, and our bids need to strike a balance between the need to have more people come back to work, more visitors and tourists in our city, but also providing the space, or particularly on our sidewalks, for eateries and other uses that have popped up during the pandemic. The tension, however, that is growing is in neighborhoods where, people close streets because, the kids were home, they needed to have a place to have recess in the middle of the day. And the safest way to do it was in front of your house with your parents looking. Traffic is on the uptake. The commuters, and DC, as I said, is a commuter town. Commuters want to be able to navigate their tried and proven pathways to downtown. And so there's a little bit of that tension that's cropping up. Some of our bike lanes in DC were sort of appropriated by our retailers and our restaurants for outdoor space. Again, lots of conflicts, some conflicts there that need to be resolved. But my sense is that some of the infrastructure that was put in place temporarily will become permanent as that conversation continues between communities.
What about in New York City?
Yeah, and I can sort of take a step back because it's been really tough for all of our, both commercial properties, but smaller properties. And our bid is a little bit less directly involved in some ways than I think Neil's is in terms of the restaurants. But so sort of taking a step back pretty early on, we were able to raise some money for some board members and administer an $800,000 grant program to help businesses pay their rent in April or May. Roughly $20,000 grants. And then we gave $10,000 grants to some of our cultural institutions. That's, I think, before we realized just how long this was all going to go on, when we thought helping for a month or two would really kind of tide people over. We did start hearing from restaurants that they were being gouged by Grubhub and Seamless and others. So we partnered with a company that pro bono developed a software system for each of them to do their own online ordering and delivery to cut out sort of the middlemen. We actually talking about sort of how businesses reconfigure their spaces. We hired StreetSense to do individual consultations with some of our small businesses to tell them what they could do to just make the space safer, but also in a way that would be affordable for them to do so. Although we did follow up with some grants to allow people to make those kind of changes. So as the pandemic has gone on, we have tried to find different ways to sort of help. The outdoor dining was clearly one piece of it. For those of you who know downtown well, Lower Manhattan specifically, our streets are very narrow, cobblestone, winding alleyways. So it was harder for some of our restaurants to do anything on the sidewalk. We did close some streets for them, working with the city so they could put tables and chairs sort of in the roadbed itself. But to Neil's point, it's fine to do that when there are no deliveries happening, when there are no kind of commercial vehicles coming by. I think as that picks up, are we going to be able to keep these streets closed? I don't know. Will the restaurants want to continue to do it? I assume so. That's different from, I live in East Midtown where there are all kinds of structures that have been put up everywhere. And Neil's right, people are starting to push back a little bit and say, why does this restaurant get to use this space for free as opposed to some other use? What about bike parking? What about other retail? What about the noise? I don't want to hear people drinking outside of my window at midnight. So it'll be interesting. The mayor has said clearly he wants it to remain permanent. I think he intends to see that through before he leaves at the end of the year. But I do hope, I actually would like for it to remain seasonally permanent, but it has to have some structure. We did it fast for obvious reasons. I wanted them to do it fast. I wanted them to do it faster. But that doesn't mean that we should just be stuck with what we have now in perpetuity.
And, I've been accused of being a Pollyanna in the past, and I, happily wear a Pollyanna badge. I like to think that during the pandemic, a certain air of pragmatism took hold of organizations and entities that maybe in the past weren't quite so pragmatic or maybe were more bureaucratic. Um, is a possible silver lining from the pandemic going forward into the future? Sort of newly forged alliances or people who maybe weren't eager to work with each other in the past, Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio aside, are there examples where there's either city council or some kind of entity and some maybe previously sort of intractable problem or irritating problem where there's some sort of too much bureaucracy around permits or something like that? Are there examples where you think going forward there might be this new kind of almost a partnership forged in wartime, almost, of going forward with a new can-do spirit? Anything like that that's emerged either in, David, anything you've heard about in certain parts of the country? And why don't you go first?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, silver linings from the pandemic itself were alluded to in what Jessica and Neil described as, even our own downtown management organizations, who are always innovating, did so in new and really serving, small business restaurants at a higher level than prior to the pandemic. So that idea of reimagining our public space was really happening, on steroids. Another silver lining, of course, was the speed or the rate at which government was operating. Now, albeit, every town is different. I know Jessica may not be, her government may not have moved as quickly as other, DC or even in Seattle and on the West Coast. But by and large, we continue to hear just enormous examples of just government moving to permitting quickly or allowing flexibility in their ordinances quickly. And so one of our challenges, I think, as an industry and as a society is, can we continue to support civic leaders who are willing to move, at breakneck speed and or just be more innovative from a bureaucratic perspective? And then coupled with that, across the board, every downtown said the major benefit that came out in the first even 3 to 6 months, any partnerships they had with civic organizations, whether it was chambers of commerce, other business alliances, social service support systems, those partnerships that were already in place were strengthened because everyone was a full court press, as you would imagine. And in addition to strengthening existing partnerships, most every downtown organization, I can't give you any one example because they've all done so, have forged new partnerships to really address whether it's, people affected by homelessness, which is one of those, intractable challenges. And so I think that what I would call civic governance is an ultimate silver lining from the pandemic, whether it's the public-private partnerships, government itself, or all of the other civic partner organizations that are helping to make our cities great.
Jessica?
That's hopeful. The dysfunction here is real. We have this other issue, and somebody sort of mentioned in the chat, we're completely turning over city government. Our primaries are June 22nd. New mayor, new controller, 2/3 of the city council will be turning over, new district attorney. So even I think some of those, if there had been alliances formed, a lot of those people will frankly be gone by the end of the year. But I will say though, you have this sort of permanent staff at the agencies. I was in the city council for 2 terms, and I talked to the same people at the Parks Department and the Transportation Department that I did, when I was 25 years ago. So I think those relationships maybe will prove beneficial. I do think at least the Transportation Department, who's usually so intractable, did kind of move more quickly, and maybe some of these things will stick. But I think less, maybe it's just such a massive kind of bureaucracy here, and I think maybe less so. Neil, bring us some optimism.
Well, I would like to think that there are new partnerships that were forced during this pandemic that will become permanent. Many of our, we have 11 business improvement districts in DC. Almost every one of our leaders was involved in some way in planning the shutdown with the mayor. So we're all on different committees. I led the committee on retail and restaurants. Others of my colleagues led real estate, blah, blah, blah. And so those partnerships continued throughout the pandemic, and some new processes and government processes in place will now go through our business improvement district. So for example, if you want to put up a streetery, your business improvement district has to approve it and apply for the permits. You know, we advocated to abolish a lot of our nonsensical regulations. First on an emergency basis, and now sort of on a permanent basis. So where it took you a month to get a permit for some minuscule thing, some permits aren't needed anymore. And then on a big sort of intractable issue on homelessness, in which is a big issue in DC, and I'm sure in many cities, lots of really great partnerships have sprung up around that, with increased revenue from the federal government, the city government providing more resources towards the issue. A lot of new partnerships have sprung up that I'm hoping would be around long past the pandemic to help with this issue.
Good. Thank you, Pollyanna. Thanks you for that. Now, in a few minutes, we'll switch to audience questions. There's some nice questions that have already been queued up by members of the audience. And if you have a question, now's a good time to type it into either chat or Q&A. But the American Rescue Act or Rescue Plan, huge amounts of federal dollars are becoming available for cities. Are there active plans underway to channel some of those dollars, direct those dollars into some of these either intractable issues or other just positive things to make our downtown more appealing, more conducive to business and commerce and people getting together? Is that something that's on the horizon for everybody? Are there big plans for those dollars to help address some of these longer standing issues?
We should probably start with Dave on this so you can give the high level view.
Sure.
Well, the answer is yes. And what we've been advocating, all of our members in particular, to do is get engaged with your municipality in that strategic decision making. For some, it's addressing intractable problems. For others, it's driving an innovation economy. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that begins to unfold. My hope, though, is that the private sector, through the bids and through other mechanisms, are equally engaged in that conversation. So we can think about, the strategic priorities of any given community. And one of the things that we saw were those communities that had strong residential component in their urban centers, were able to survive a little better through the heart of the pandemic because the customer base that was working from home was still there. So if you're a community who didn't have a strong residential base and had some barriers to overcome, these stimulus dollars could be redeployed to help, additionally incentivize either new housing projects or conversion projects. But for other cities, it may be more of a transportation and public space initiative that's necessary. So the bottom line is, as long as we can get all of the civic partners engaged in that strategic planning for deployment of those resources locally, then I think we'll be successful. If it just sits inside of elected leadership at a near-term kind of deployment, then we're probably not going to see the long-term benefit. But Neil, Jessica.
Yeah, no, I would add to that. David's exactly right. In DC, we are going to benefit to the tune of $2.2 billion that we thought we had to raise taxes to cover a gap for. And the mayor and our deputy mayor for economic development, to their credit, said, we want all ideas on how to spend this money. And so our business improvement districts have become a real focal point of strategy and information on how to possibly use these funds. We meet as a group of bid leaders every other Tuesday. We are joined regularly by members of the city government leadership, brainstorming, use of these funds. All of us have sort of our own parochial ideas and how to use them, and so we get that into the conversation. But on the DC side, there has been a real intentional outreach by the by the government administration to involve the broader community in developing plans to spend those dollars. So we're really pleased about that.
Jessica?
Well, I mean, we're super fortunate to have Senator Schumer leading the majority in the Senate. So, you know, he secured over 24 billion in direct aid for the city and state, and then billions more for the MTA for other agencies. Only in New York would that happen, and we would still raise taxes. Maybe Seattle. I don't know, actually.
We'd have a levy.
The state legislature
You're
did.
not the only city. DC is talking about raising taxes, the most ridiculous thing. But
Senator Schumer was not pleased. That was the whole point of him delivering, you know, however, you know, $50 billion to New York. But the one thing I guess I would say, I mean, the bailout for mass transit really was quite helpful, but one of the things that we stopped talking about during the Trump years was resiliency and climate change. And, you know, clearly after Superstorm Sandy, the neighborhood was really devastated, and there has been a lot of work happening behind the scenes on what could be done just from an engineering and a regulatory perspective, but those conversations were not going to go anywhere for obvious reasons. And so my hope would be in terms of sort of longer, you know, looking forward for additional funds that come in, be it infrastructure or other things, that at least from our perspective, we could start to have a conversation again about climate change and resiliency downtown.
And in this area, you know, King County, the county government outside Seattle, has been focusing on purchasing hotels and things like that, and they've been very successful in addressing homelessness. DSA here is working with the city council to encourage them to focus those federal dollars directly on homelessness. It's clearly the problem that was in the way of lots of progress long before the pandemic too. So it's that to me seems like a silver lining, the ability to get those federal dollars and address a very important issue. Now, all right, I want to get to some of our audience questions now. This is from Michael. Do you see the younger generations, millennials, Generation Z, contributing to the reinvigorations of your respective cities? If so, do you have plans to tap into that? So are there generational differences in spurring the recovery in your individual cities? Neil?
yeah, so I'm the oldest person on my team, and happy that I am. No, there's one person older than me, but he wouldn't admit it. So what we've seen in this pandemic is sort of the younger generation stepping up, at least in our organization and in DC, in a big way. No disrespect to people over 40 or 45. As an example, you know, one of our colleagues in my office decided that, you know, she was going to go out on her own, and she's now making more than she made at the bid, with our organization being one of her clients. But a lot of the great ideas that allowed restaurants and businesses to continue to operate at some level during the pandemic came out of these groups, interest groups, particularly of the younger generation, that the city government started paying attention to. So for example, permits for food trucks were sort of relegated to the downtown and commercial area. Well, there's no one in the downtown or the commercial business areas. And so on one of sort of a group chat, someone made a great suggestion. Hey, why don't you waive parking regulations in their neighborhood so that food trucks could actually plow some business in those communities. So huge contributions, at least in downtown DC, from sort of the younger generation. So the challenge that we all face with is, you know, who is going to return to work? So we did a survey recently, anonymous survey, and people identified sort of their age group. And what we're finding is that the younger you are, the less reluctant you are to come back to the office 5 days a week. And so, you know, that for me is an opportunity for engagement at folks at every age spectrum, so that we come to sort of an optimal decision point on how we bring people back into the office. But the contributions have been huge by the younger community.
What about in Lower Manhattan?
I think Neil answered that beautifully. I may be happy to take a different question, because I mean.
Okay, yeah.
And Felix, what I would add is I think, sometimes it's been overplayed, this exodus from the urban centers, especially from, say, the millennial generation. I think what we'll find is those that were probably going to migrate for either family reasoning and or did so temporarily was probably more along normal, maybe accelerated normal. But that we fully expect, those who are urban dwellers will return and or stayed. And more importantly, we're seeing that the Gen Z is really following very closely with what we experienced with the millennials. There is an appetite for that exciting, downtown urban experience. My own son, by example, is not looking to move out into the suburbs, and he's, getting as close to the core as he can as a, newly minted graduate, as are many of his colleagues. So I think some of the migration was to be expected and slightly accelerated, but I think we're still right where we would expect to be, and that next generation coming into the workforce is going to, mimic the previous even more so than maybe many expected.
Yeah, and I think from even like the generation that's currently in college, I know they've experienced something together. Isolation during the pandemic, the on-campus multiple testing, whatever the college experience was, I think that's going to forge bonds that we won't see the benefits of for a decade or two. As those people reach their 30s and 40s, they'll have this sort of shared experience of having survived the pandemic. I still think 15 to 25-year-olds bore the brunt of the emotional toll of the pandemic. And I think but it does bond them together, almost not quite Stockholm syndrome, but they have this shared experience. Here's another question. This is from Bill. It says, what are your thoughts on the perceived shortage of labor and trying to get people back to work, and how this may affect the ability of these downtowns to achieve full recovery? Do you see this as a major problem? Who wants to take that?
Well, I can just concur that we're definitely hearing that there's in the hospitality and leisure sector, it's difficult to find employment. So, workforce development programs are beginning to take hold in some of our organizations, but it's absolutely not unique to Seattle. It's many of the downtowns. Jessica, I think you had a response.
Had a much harder time, hiring the field staff, the sanitation workers, the public safety workers, for obvious reasons. Unemployment was, they were doing better on unemployment than they were working for us. Some of them relocated for other reasons. And so we're very actively trying to rehire, and it's not easy.
Okay. Anything to add, Neil?
Yeah, no, we are seeing a real shortage of in the hospitality and leisure sector as hotels are reopening in DC. Well, hotels never really close, but they're ramping up and visitors are coming in. There are rooms that have to be put offline because just can't find people to work. Even in our office, we hire over 100 people, and some folks, we're losing people because they're getting paid better even at a restaurant rather than at a bid, and we pay on average $21 an hour to start. So there's a real shortage of labor in DC.
All right. This is a question from Bob. Today's Wall Street Journal highlights a serious increase in crime in cities across America, with law and order becoming a major issue in New York's mayoral campaign. Is crime a serious deterrent to the return to our cities?
Yeah, I would say yes. And I spent months telling everybody to stop reading the New York Post because they wanted you to think we were in like the 7th layer of hell in New York, and we weren't. But I will say in the last month or so, violent crimes have been up, shootings have been up. I don't actually think it's related to the pandemic. There are lots of, we could have a whole nother discussion about criminal justice reform and other things. We haven't even really seen, we just legalized marijuana, but that hasn't even come into effect yet. So it is an issue. And then, one of the leading candidates for mayor, Eric Adams, is a former police officer. So I think he's obviously talking about public safety as well quite a bit. And you have very different views in communities of color about what the appropriate levels of policing are. That's not unique to us, but very divided opinions within some communities. So yes, there are lots of heated discussions happening in the context of the mayoral election. It's something we're keeping our eye on here. I hope we don't return to sort of the bad old days. I think big picture, we're still pretty safe, but there have been some, when tourists get shot in the middle of Times Square in the afternoon, that's not a good look.
Yeah, we're seeing an uptick in crime in DC, but that uptick has been occurring over the last 36 months rather than over the last 18 months or so. There's lots of schools of thought about why that is the case in DC, but no one really knows the answer. But it is concerning and on the minds of everyone in DC.
All right. And, during the last year and a half or so, or actually about a year or so of demonstrations and protests around equity, is there an opportunity here in addressing longstanding issues around equity in our cities that either the federal dollars or new energy to address problems will create for moving forward and addressing those equity issues in downtowns? David?
Yeah, I think, and I can only speak for DC. I think the uprisings and the civil unrest in the spring and summer of last year was a real awakening for the business community in DC. Everybody knows that two block area in front of the White House is now called Black Lives Matter Plaza. And it was sort of what I thought was sort of a middle finger to the then president of the United States. But the mayor thinks otherwise. But it's really started a conversation in DC, particularly in the business community, about hiring, about equity and inclusion and all the other issues. And so our business improvement districts have we haven't jumped into the fray, but we're part of that conversation. Our DC Bid Council now has a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative that we've embarked on. And the goal of that initiative is not to make any of us woke, because I think we as leaders in the bid community are woke enough, but it's how do we encourage our stakeholders to sort of embrace that. And so there is an awakening happening. And I've got to say, my board, I have 39 board members. Very few of them look like me, but they are the leaders in this conversation in their businesses, but also pushing my organization to be a leader in that conversation. So I think it's here to stay, and people are embracing it.
David or Jessica?
Not only organizations like the Bid Council in DC, but California Downtown Association for the entire state has really taken this initiative on directly. I think what Neil described was really the challenge before all of the downtowns, which is you've got individual professionals through the bids, through the management organizations, all of whom understand the benefit of an inclusive community. And there's a lot that CEOs like Jessica and Neil can do in and of their own organization, but they're also representing property owners and can only make suggestions, if you will, some of which are leaders, some which may not yet be at that stage. And then there's large corporate stakeholders. So again, finding our members in the middle of the conversation to help set the stage. Most are doing yeoman's job of really bringing the conversation forward, because last summer I think is, in my opinion, a national pivot point where we will begin to address systemic racism in a proactive manner, and it's really going to be our work for the next several decades to overcome what has been centuries of inequity. So I'm really looking forward to the opportunity that's coming out of the pandemic, where we see opportunity to address, when you say intractable problems of homelessness or things of that nature. I think building more inclusive, equitable communities is something that is exactly our opportunity moving forward, and bids are taking a leadership role in setting that stage.
Yeah. I would just say clearly around affordable housing, education. I mean, I have a 14-year-old, I have a 10-year-old, they go to different schools. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things to me about the pandemic was just how unfairly and unequally, it impacted children across the city based on race and class and economic backgrounds. And so whoever is leading our city a year from now, how we address that and not just have sort of a lost year or two for so many children is a real issue.
Yeah, I agree. You just have a couple minutes left, and I have one question I want to ask each of you, and this is, what was the most encouraging little thing that you've seen in your downtown or heard from your ratepayers or members in the past week or so, or it could be the past month? What's the most encouraging little thing you've seen that gives you the most hope for the future? You want to go first, Neil?
Sure. So I don't know that I heard it from any of my ratepayers. The Boston Marathon is running again this fall. Something I look forward to every year. And I'm going to run it this fall. I'm happy to be around 28 or 29,000 people without a mask. So that's what's giving me hope right now, Felix. I'm sorry.
And I'm running New
makes
York,
perfect sense to me. No.
I was at the governor's announcement this week about the marathon and other things, and I had that moment, maybe you did too, of like, I'm so excited. Oh no, I have a lot of work to do.
Maybe we can get David excited about that too, so we can train together.
Oh goodness, I don't think you want to. I still have running shoes when I first started dating my wife 30 years ago that, they sit on the shelf with only a few miles on them. I'm not the runner, you all are. But I do think it's been inspiring that we're just hearing kind of and seeing through Zoom excitement in people talking about, I went to a restaurant, with my spouse or my significant other, and we didn't wear a mask, or we went and we just started re-engaging with society with or without the mask. There's this, I think, positivity that's come out in the last several weeks that's taken everyone a little bit by surprise, because they were expecting a little bit of a slow roll coming back into it. And right now it's been a lot more smiles, like, yeah, everyone seems, if you're vaccinated, to be comfortable. And I love what was on the radio or on the news, which is that's why we're doing a vaccination program, to get back towards some degree of normal. So it's been exciting.
All right. Yeah. And I am encouraged. I am a Pollyanna. I do think things have happened during the pandemic that will be a silver lining that will pay off in positive ways going forward. I want to thank Neil Albert, David Downey, and Jessica Lappin, our panelists. I want to thank Downtown Seattle Association for producing the virtual access series, especially John Scholes, Sally Wright, James Cito, and Emily Baylor. I want to thank Amazon for their support. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, all your great questions. Thanks for supporting DSA. I'm Felix Bunnell. Stay safe, and we'll see you downtown.